Under the dull, overcast light of February 8, 2006, the Elwood family's routine began like it always did. Jamie, only 8 years old, zipped up his red jacket, grabbed his backpack, and stepped out of the front door onto the gravel drive that led down toward the county road. His mother, Dana, remembered watching him from the kitchen window, cereal bowl in one hand, eyes half on the clock. She remembered waving. She remembered him waving back. The bus came just after 7:05 a.m., as it had for years. Route 46, a yellow diesel that coughed black in the winter air and squealed at every turn. Jamie climbed aboard, nodded at the driver, and walked toward his usual seat, second to last row, window side. That was the last confirmed sighting of him. The route passed through sparsely populated Appalachian backroads. Some kids lived in single trailers miles apart, others gathered at shared pull-offs. There were 13 other students on board that morning. The driver, Teresa Connell, completed the route without incident. There were no disruptions. No one remembers Jamie getting off. No one remembers him crying, complaining, or asking to be let out early. But when the roll call was taken at Tremont Elementary, Jamie was marked absent. His teacher assumed he was sick. It wasn't until later that morning, around 10:17 a.m., when Dana Elwood called the school to ask if Jamie had dropped off a permission slip for an upcoming field trip, that the realization began to set in. The office told her Jamie hadn't been in class. Dana corrected them. He had gotten on the bus. She watched him. The confusion turned to concern. Then the school called the transportation department. Teresa Connell was called in. Her voice was steady, confused. She said she didn't remember Jamie getting off, but she hadn't noticed anything strange. By noon, the Elwoods had called the police. A full route retrace began that afternoon. State troopers and sheriff's deputies rode with Connell as she drove the exact same path, stop by stop. Jamie's name was called. Trees and ditches were searched. Canines were brought in but struggled to find any meaningful scent. There were no reports of strangers on the route, no tire marks where they shouldn't be. The children who rode that morning were interviewed. Most didn't remember seeing Jamie at all. A few did, but couldn't say when he was no longer there. The boy who usually sat beside him said Jamie had been extra quiet that day. One student claimed he saw Jamie lean forward like he dropped something. Another said he thought Jamie had asked the driver something before they got to Miller's Hill. The driver didn't recall that. By sunset, search teams had combed every ditch, shed, and tree line along the entire route. Nothing. Authorities impounded the bus, number 46, and parked it in the district's maintenance lot. Forensics swept the seats, undercarriage, and floor for blood, fibers, anything. Nothing was found. No blood, no prints out of place, no signs of struggle, not a single footprint led into the woods, no sign of abduction, no screams, no witnesses. The bus, in every observable way, had done its job. Except it hadn't. Investigators considered if Jamie had somehow gotten off without being noticed. Maybe he'd run away. But 8-year-olds don't just disappear into the forest with no trace. He had no reason to leave, no signs of distress, no history of trauma, no unusual internet use. His home life was stable, his parents were devastated. That night, a code red alert was issued across 4 counties. Helicopters scanned with heat-sensing cameras. Local hunters were asked to check deer stands. Nothing. The ground had been hard that morning, lightly frozen from a cold snap the night before. Yet not a single shoe print near any stop led away from the route. In desperation, police questioned everyone again. Teachers, classmates, drivers on the same road that day. The last confirmed evidence of Jamie's existence remained the morning his mother waved to him through the window and watched him step onto that yellow bus. What happened between that gravel driveway and the school doors was a void. Days passed, then weeks. The bus sat untouched in the maintenance lot. It had already been cleared once, but no one had examined what was underneath the vehicle. No one had looked closely at the frame itself, beneath the rust behind the heat shields, or inside the metal recesses behind the rear axle. No one thought a child could fit there. And so, for the next 18 years, it remained there, silent, rusting, forgotten. and so did the boy. The first major review of the case began 48 hours after Jamie Elwood vanished. By then, every bus stop along Route 46 had been photographed, re-walked, and analyzed. Police compiled timestamp estimates based on the driver's usual route time and cross-checked them with student drop-off memories. Still, nothing placed Jamie definitively beyond that initial boarding. One by one, detectives sat down with the children again, away from their parents this time, in quiet school offices, asking them to replay the morning as clearly as they could. One boy, 10-year-old Caleb Reiser, sat forward in his chair and said he saw Jamie get off, not at his usual stop, but somewhere else. It had a green roof, Caleb said, like shiny green. The house. He stepped down and ran to it. Investigators froze. No one else mentioned a house. They asked again. Caleb repeated it, confused at their reaction. "He got off," he said, firmer this time. "I saw him go." But when the detectives laid out photos from every stop on Route 46, Caleb pointed to a stretch between Hollow Creek and Keller Road. "There," he said, "the green roof." That stretch of road was nothing but forest. No homes, no green roofs, just trees and a wide shoulder with an old wooden fence falling in on itself. Still, officers canvassed the area again. Helicopters were rerouted to double-check the air footage. Nothing appeared out of place. There was no structure visible, new or abandoned. But Caleb's certainty lingered, especially when he mentioned that Jamie seemed like he was going home to it. By day 4, the bus surveillance footage was finally recovered. The onboard camera system recorded low-resolution clips of student movement, but that morning's data was corrupted. The file loaded but wouldn't play beyond the first few seconds. It showed Jamie boarding. Then the screen froze. When technicians tried to recover the corrupted segment, they found the internal date had reset to 1999, 7 years before the incident. The bus's maintenance records showed the system had last been serviced in December. There were no prior malfunctions. Without camera footage, authorities leaned on route timing. But even that had a gap. Teresa Connell, the driver, noted one stop ran longer than usual, the Hollow Creek turnout. She said a dog had crossed the road, and she paused for a few extra seconds. That stop was directly across from the wooded stretch where Caleb claimed to see the green-roofed house. Detectives returned again, this time walking deeper into the trees. About 400 feet in, behind a line of overgrown brush and fallen timber, they found it. A road. Not paved, just gravel and black coal dust pressed into the soil. Narrow, curved. It had once been used for access to an old mining parcel, but it was unmarked, and on modern GPS it registered as solid terrain. No driveways, no addresses, no trace of structures. The road curved sharply left into a thicket of hemlocks and disappeared into shadow. Records from the mining office confirmed it had been a utility road, decommissioned in 1987 after a shaft collapse. The company had gone bankrupt. Land records were vague. Several parcels had changed hands through shell corporations, but nowhere did it show any legal residences in that stretch. Still, the path had clear signs of occasional use. Boot prints, tire ruts too recent to be from decades ago. Someone had been there. Search teams pushed farther in. They found a makeshift gate of corrugated steel wire, bent out of shape but still hanging. Then, an old rusted sign half buried in the soil. Elkwood Processing. A few low structures emerged past the bend. One had a roof, green metal, mostly intact. A storage shed, maybe, with scorched walls and a collapsed side panel. No utilities, no power lines. Inside, only burnt insulation, some scrap lumber, and a shattered glass pane the size of a school bus window. When shown photos of the site, Caleb nodded. "That's it," he whispered. "That's where he went." But the forensics team found no trace of Jamie, no blood, no fabric, no prints. Still, the existence of the green-roofed structure shifted the tone of the case. Now there was a location, one off the official maps, one hidden, likely for a reason. Detectives searched property transfer logs again, this time focusing on the Elkwood land deeds. One name popped up, a maintenance contractor listed briefly in 2005 for a single inspection. The name was redacted in one place, handwritten in another, R. Malloy. He was hired under subcontract and terminated within weeks. No further employment records could be found. His file was missing from the school district's archive. As the investigation expanded into Elkwood's strange property web, something else happened. A call came in from a retired coal inspector who lived 2 counties over. He'd heard about the road discovery on the local news. Said he remembered something from years ago, back when Elkwood folded. One of the garages had been padlocked, sealed off for environmental concerns. But there was never a cleanup crew. He said the garage had a pit, something deep, industrial, and off the books. Not for oil changes, he said. For dumping. They didn't want people near it. When police returned to the site, the garage was already gone. Collapsed, likely decades ago. Nothing but dirt, ash, and a depression in the ground. But beneath the soil, they found a hatch, welded shut, sealed from the outside. The team stood over it in silence. Whatever was buried beneath the rust, it hadn't been opened in a very long time. It was almost a week after Jamie's disappearance when a call came in from a family in the nearby Hollow Ridge subdivision. Their daughter, Lily Denham, had been on the bus that morning. She was 10, quiet, usually unnoticed. Her parents hadn't thought to say anything at first. Like most of the children, Lily hadn't noticed Jamie get off. She assumed he'd never gotten on. But then she saw his face on the local news, and something shifted. She became restless at night, told her mother she couldn't stop thinking about the sound. At first her mother dismissed it. Kids get spooked easily during missing child cases, but Lily kept repeating herself. She didn't say she saw anything, just heard something. It wasn't loud, she said, not like a scream. More like someone gasping, like trying to yell but couldn't. Her parents pressed for details. All Lily could remember was that it happened near Miller's Hill. She had her head against the window when she heard a gasp, followed by a metallic grinding sound. She thought maybe it was the bus bottoming out or the suspension creaking. But it only happened once. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone until the news ran a piece showing Jamie's red jacket and a map of the route. The gasp, she said, happened right before the woods started, before the road dipped near the turnout where the green roof structure had been found. Her mother called the police. The officer who took the report asked to speak to Lily directly. She repeated her account, this time adding that she remembered Jamie walking past her that morning. He was humming, she said, like something under his breath. Then later, I didn't see him anymore. With this new detail, detectives ordered another inspection of the bus, Bus 46. The initial forensic sweep had cleared it, but only for blood, fingerprints, and basic anomalies. This time, they brought in a veteran mechanic from the district's retired staff, someone who knew the model year inside out. The mechanic, Robert Kilpatrick, worked methodically, checking suspension joints, panel fastenings, axle lines, frame welds. After 2 hours, he flagged something odd. The passenger side rear wheel well had a strange gouge along the inner shield. It wasn't fresh, but it was deeper than typical road wear. More than one, actually. 4 long scratches, uneven in width. 2 deeper than the others, tapering out like pressure had changed mid-drag. Kilpatrick said it looked like something sharp had scraped upward and out, not the other way around. A rock wouldn't do that from the outside, but the alignment of the scratches suggested they were made from within, possibly by fingers or something clawed. The scratches weren't visible without removing the shield plate, and even then, only under direct light and at the right angle. No paint transfer, no DNA. But to Kilpatrick, the implication was disturbing. That's not something that happens from routine wear, he said. That's something desperate. He checked the surrounding compartment, specifically the area just beyond the wheel well where the internal body of the bus curved downward to meet the undercarriage. The space was tight, impossibly narrow for a child to fit inside intentionally. But if someone had fallen through a gap or been forced underneath, it was just wide enough to trap them. Kilpatrick measured the cavity. It was only accessible if a specific interior panel had been dislodged. When asked if a child could have crawled in there, he hesitated. Not unless they were trying to hide, or someone put them there. Still, there was no concrete proof. Nobody. No direct evidence. Just a 10-year-old's recollection of a gasping sound and claw-like scratches in a place no one would have thought to look. It wasn't enough for a warrant, but it reignited the case. Detectives re-reviewed the original statements. Teresa Connell, the driver, had never mentioned hearing anything out of the ordinary. But when re-interviewed, she admitted something that hadn't seemed relevant before. She said she remembered a weird tilt in the bus's balance that morning. Not a mechanical issue, just a moment when she felt like the vehicle shifted unevenly, as if something heavy had moved underneath. It lasted only seconds. At the time, she assumed it was a pothole. Now she wasn't sure. Investigators pushed harder on mechanical theories. Could the boy have fallen through a panel? Could the bus itself have had a design flaw? District maintenance logs showed no reports of missing screws, broken panels, or faulty seals. But one note from a prior service mentioned rear access hatch loose, secured temporarily. No details beyond that. No follow-up repairs logged. It didn't sit right. A child gasps, something scrapes, and then he vanishes on a bus no one leaves. It suggested movement, panic, an attempt to escape something or signal for help. And yet no one saw a thing. No one heard more than a faint sound over the rumble of the road. By the end of that week, the forensic team began planning for a partial disassembly of Bus 46. If Jamie had somehow gotten beneath the cabin frame, they'd find traces, fibers, prints, something. But for now, all they had were marks. Silent, desperate, human. The last thing Kilpatrick said before packing up his tools was that he didn't think those scratches had been made all at once. He thought they were made slowly, over time, like someone tried more than once to claw their way free. The Elwood house on Chestnut Ridge hadn't changed much since Jamie disappeared. The porch steps were still uneven, the kitchen light still flickered if you turned the switch too fast. But inside, time had stopped. His bedroom remained exactly as he left it, red flannel sheets, school books stacked in the corner, a plastic dinosaur on the windowsill. The closet door was half open, jacket still hanging, except for the one he wore that morning. Dana never washed the laundry hamper again. She said it still smelled like him. Every night for years she left a plate out at dinner. Sometimes it had food, sometimes it didn't. But the place was always set. The silverware stayed perfectly aligned. The chairs stayed pulled back, as if waiting. They didn't eat in silence either. Dinah talked. She told Jamie what she'd seen on the news, what she'd read, what his teachers had said. She told him about the snow, the neighbors' dogs, and the packages that arrived. Most nights she cried softly after. But the plate was cleared like any other meal. Jamie's father, Michael, reacted differently. The first year, he worked double shifts at the mill, coming home only to shower and change. But after that, something shifted. He joined a local volunteer search and rescue group, even though most of the formal search had ended months prior. He took wilderness training classes, learned to track prints, studied soil displacement and scent decay. He kept Jamie's photo laminated in his wallet, updated every year with a new age progression from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. In 2008, Michael led a volunteer sweep near the old Elkwood trailhead, far beyond where law enforcement had focused. 14 miles from the original route, while cutting through heavy pine, he stopped cold. Hanging from a low branch ahead was a red jacket, torn and stained. He sprinted toward it. The group heard him scream before they caught up. But when they arrived, the tag on the collar told the truth. It wasn't Jamie's. Wrong size. Wrong brand. A local hiker's emergency parka lost months prior during a storm. Michael collapsed. Paramedics were called. He wouldn't speak for 2 days. After that, he stopped searching with the group. He stayed home, spent more time walking the property line, standing at the edge of the woods like he was listening for something. At night, Dana would find him sitting in Jamie's room, holding the boy's sneakers, sometimes just staring at the wall, sometimes talking to someone who wasn't there. By 2010, the case had made national news. A segment on America's Unanswered brought renewed attention, but no new leads. Tips flooded in, thousands of them, some well-meaning, some deranged. A gas station clerk in Kentucky claimed he saw Jamie with a woman in a white van. A woman from Ohio mailed in a drawing of a vision she had of Jamie in a basement. A man from Arkansas claimed he could speak to missing children through dreams. None of it led anywhere. Then came the theories. Online forums exploded with speculation. Some claimed Jamie had been abducted by someone on the bus and hidden in plain sight. Others suggested he'd been mistakenly dropped off and met a stranger on the access road. The green-roofed structure became an obsession. Someone claimed it had been used by a fringe religious group in the 1980s. Another posted grainy satellite images, insisting the mine road showed evidence of recent vehicle use. None of it could be verified. A more sinister thread accused the school district of a cover-up. They pointed to the failed dash cam, the missing maintenance logs, and the bus driver's vague responses in early interviews. Some believed the driver, Teresa Connell, had seen more than she admitted. Others said she'd been threatened into silence. Her sudden resignation later that year only fueled the suspicion. There were even rumors that Bus 46 had a second hidden compartment used during the mining days to move equipment. A few insisted it had been used for trafficking. No evidence supported this, but the speculation didn't stop. Some even accused Michael and Dana of orchestrating a hoax. A man in Pennsylvania published a blog accusing the Elwoods of faking their son's disappearance for attention and donations. They never asked for money, never held fundraisers, never appeared at charity events. But the accusation still burned. Through it all, the Elwoods endured quietly. They stopped speaking to reporters after 2011. They stopped answering the door for strangers. They installed a security camera after someone left a worn red jacket on their porch, folded like an offering. Dana buried it in the backyard. The house slowly transformed into something else, not just a home, but a monument. Every photo Jamie had ever taken was printed and framed. His school drawings hung in the hallway. His baby shoes sat on the mantel. A candle burned each night in the kitchen window, facing the road where the bus had once come. What no one outside the family knew was that, in the garage, Michael kept a wall of maps, string-connecting stop points, timestamps, and newspaper clippings. A red thread always led back to the same place, the woods behind Hollow Creek. It didn't matter how many times they were searched. He believed Jamie had gotten off the bus there, and he believed someone knew why. Each year, on February 8th, they left the porch light on all night. Not for show, not for attention, just in case the road, for once, decided to give something back. Teresa Connell had driven the morning routes in Tremont County for nearly 20 years. She knew every turn, every stop, every child's name and preferred seat. She was steady, punctual, and quiet. Most students described her as kind but distant, rarely smiling, rarely speaking unless necessary. After Jamie Elwood's disappearance, she didn't return to work. Within 2 weeks, she filed for medical leave citing acute stress response and left the district permanently 3 months later without public explanation. She never gave interviews, never stood beside the other drivers when the press gathered, and no one, not investigators, not reporters, could get her to speak again. Privately, however, Teresa told her sister something strange not long after the boy went missing. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't claim to know what happened, but she said the morning Jamie disappeared, something felt off. She said she kept checking her rearview mirror after the final stop, even after the kids were gone, that she felt like she wasn't alone on the return trip. "I thought someone was still on board," she said, "but I never found anyone." Her sister, Denise, later told police that Teresa couldn't sleep for weeks. She had nightmares, woke up gasping, said she sometimes thought she could still hear footsteps behind her seat. She stopped going to the store, started keeping the blinds closed at home. Once, when a neighborhood kid's red hoodie blew into her yard, she reportedly refused to touch it. Denise had to come retrieve it. When pressed, Teresa insisted she never saw Jamie get off the bus, but she never swore he didn't. There was a vagueness to her answers that made investigators uneasy. She wasn't withholding in an obvious way. It was more like she didn't trust her own memory, like she was afraid that if she looked too closely, she'd find something she couldn't live with. Years passed, and Teresa faded from public memory. Her house sat at the edge of Hemlock Lane, hidden by trees, barely visible from the road. She received a pension, lived alone, and spoke to no one outside her sister and the occasional grocery clerk. But in early 2011, a documentary team producing a segment on the Elwood case managed to track her down. One of the producers left a handwritten letter, another sent flowers. They didn't expect a reply. To their surprise, Teresa called them 4 days later. Her voice was soft, careful. She asked if they were recording. They said no. She agreed to speak, not on camera, but in audio. She said she remembered more than she'd said back then. She didn't elaborate, but she asked to set a date, March 14th. They agreed. She requested they meet at her home. She said she was finally ready. The interview never happened. On the night of March 1st, 2 weeks before the scheduled meeting, a 911 call came from a neighbor on Hemlock Lane. Flames were visible from Teresa's garage. By the time the fire department arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. The blaze had moved fast, unnaturally fast, some said, and the garage roof had already collapsed. Teresa was found near the back hallway, unconscious from smoke inhalation. She was pulled from the house, but later died at the hospital. She was 57. The fire report listed the origin point as the garage wall near the breaker panel. The ruling. Undetermined cause. No accelerants were officially found, but investigators noted burn patterns that raised questions: the speed of ignition, the angle of spread. Several files were reportedly found charred in the garage office, old paper records stored in boxes. One label was barely legible: 46 maint. Logs. There was no evidence of forced entry, but one neighbor recalled seeing a white pickup parked across the street earlier that evening. They didn't recognize it. The vehicle was gone before the fire started. Police canvassed the area, asked for doorbell footage, but none existed. No license plate, no follow-up. Denise was devastated. She told officers she had no idea why Teresa would have agreed to speak after all those years. She hadn't mentioned the call, hadn't said she was planning to talk to anyone. But a notebook was found on Teresa's kitchen counter, water damaged but mostly intact. Several pages listed dates, names, and route times from 2006. One entry stood out. It read, "Back panel loose. I heard it shift. March 2006, told Malloy." The name meant little to Denise, but to investigators, it struck a chord. Richard Malloy had been hired temporarily in late 2005 to assist with fleet maintenance. His employment record was thin, mostly subcontracted labor, with references that never returned calls. He'd been terminated in April 2006, 2 months after Jamie vanished. No reason listed. Authorities attempted to locate Malloy, but their leads hit dead ends. The last known address was abandoned. The phone number listed had been disconnected for years. No current tax filings, no social media, no registered vehicle, as if he'd simply vanished. Teresa's death left a silence in the case that never quite lifted. Whatever she'd planned to say, whatever she remembered or feared, died with her. The garage was demolished weeks later. No physical evidence was ever recovered from the rubble. But in the weeks that followed, one of the documentary producers received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a copy of Teresa's school district ID badge and a folded note. The note read only, "The bus wasn't empty, and it wasn't broken." The handwriting matched the notebook on her kitchen counter. By early 2024, the old transportation yard at the edge of Tremont was more rusty than the fleet. The district had finally authorized the clearance of the lot, selling off the long-abandoned buses for scrap. Most were beyond repair. Tires rotted out, windows shattered, paint faded to a dull, powdery shell. Nature had taken much of it back. Grass pushed up through the gravel. Ivy coiled around the side mirrors. Inside, dust coated every surface like a second skin. Among the decommissioned hulks was Bus 46. Still parked in the same rear corner it had been towed to 18 years earlier. It hadn't run since the Elwood case. Most assumed it had been dismantled or scrapped long ago. But it sat untouched, marked "Do Not Process" in faded paint across the windshield. The tag had been placed by the sheriff's office back in 2006. No one ever removed it. The job of salvaging parts from the old fleet went to a local father and son mechanic team, Dean and Caleb Mercer. Dean had worked on district buses for decades, and his son had recently returned from a stint in the military, looking for steady work. Their assignment was simple: strip usable parts, drain fluids, prep for towing. When they got to bus 46, Dean hesitated. "Thought they'd gotten rid of this one," he muttered. The records were murky. Some said it had been cleared. Others claimed it was held in evidence, but never logged. Either way, the new district supervisor signed off on its removal. Dean and Caleb opened the doors, letting the stale air spill out. Inside, the seats were mostly intact, dried leaves gathered at the front. There was graffiti on the windows, names etched by kids who had no idea what had once happened inside. Dean worked the interior, while Caleb set up the jack to begin draining the fuel tank and removing the rear wheels. As he slid under the bus, he paused. The undercarriage was worse than he expected, rusted solid in places, the frame flaking like old bark. He positioned the light, leaned in farther, and stopped cold. Near the rear axle, just behind the exhaust shield, was something pale lodged deep in the crawl space between the supports. It was small, curled, almost unrecognizable. Caleb called for his father. Dean joined him underneath. Together they inched closer, brushing away debris. What they found was a sneaker, faded, cracked, still laced, a child's size wedged so tightly into the cavity that it looked fused to the metal. Dean pulled back immediately. "We're not touching this," he said. "Call the sheriff." Now, within the hour, the lot was cordoned off. A forensic team arrived the next morning. They brought equipment, floodlights, and a mobile lab. The crawl space where the shoe had been found was barely accessible. A rust-collapsed compartment between the bus body and a heat panel no wider than 10 inches. It would have been invisible during a standard inspection, but the team worked carefully, removing panel after panel, rusted bolt by rusted bolt. After nearly 6 hours, they opened the cavity fully. What they found inside left them silent. Wedged into the crawl space was more than just a shoe. Bones, small, curved, a pelvis, parts of a rib cage, scraps of fabric fused to the wall, a child's sock, still inside the shoe, still folded as if it had once wrapped a foot. The remains were brittle, partially mummified, preserved by the sealed metal and the lack of exposure. No animal intrusion, no weathering. They recovered what they could. A full forensic inventory was scheduled, but everyone already knew the dimensions, the location, the object lodged inside. All of it pointed to one person. DNA confirmation came within a week. Jamie Elwood, missing since 2006, officially presumed dead but never found, until now. The announcement sent shockwaves through the town. News outlets scrambled to the site. Cameras stood outside the district building. Former teachers were re-interviewed. The Elwoods, now gray-haired and hollow-eyed, stood in front of their porch in silence as reporters gathered across the street. Dinah clutched Jamie's baby shoes. Michael said nothing at all. Investigators tried to make sense of the space. How did a child get in there? The cavity was almost impossible to access from inside the bus. It wasn't listed on any blueprint. It was more like a defect, an unintentional compartment where the frame had warped during manufacture or repair. Still, it had held a body for 18 years without anyone noticing. More chilling was the way the sneaker had been positioned, as if someone had tried to kick free or wedge it to hold their position. There were faint scratch marks along the wall, fingernail indentations, shallow, desperate. And then there was the smell. One of the forensic techs, seasoned and calm, said he'd smelled something like it once before, inside an old grain silo where a worker had been trapped for weeks. Dry death, he called it, quiet, lingering. The district issued a statement. They claimed they were unaware the bus had never been properly dismantled, blamed poor record-keeping, outdated systems. But the families of Tremont didn't care about excuses. They wanted answers. How had no one found him? How had no one heard him? How did a child die inside a school bus without anyone seeing it happen? Dean Mercer refused further work. Caleb didn't speak to reporters. But weeks later, he mentioned something to a local deputy off the record. When he crawled under that bus, he said it wasn't just the shoe that caught his eye. It was the way it pointed toward the road, like someone had tried to turn, even in death, like he had still hoped someone might see. It took more than 12 hours to remove what was left of Jamie Elwood from the compartment beneath bus 46. The forensic team worked slowly, each movement calculated, each bolt turned with care. What they found was worse than what anyone had expected. The remains weren't simply lodged, they were folded, curled in on themselves, knees pulled tight to chest, spine curved like a question mark. His skull was tilted downward, jaw resting near the clavicle. No one could understand how a body that size could fit into such a narrow space. One of the techs later said it looked like he'd been pressed inward, not just fallen in, like the space had reshaped him. When the body was finally laid out on a sterile tarp inside the mobile unit, the preliminary findings began to paint a picture. The skeletal structure showed multiple microfractures along the ribs and femurs, consistent with prolonged compression. His arms had been tucked awkwardly beneath his torso, elbows bent in a way that suggested he'd tried to reposition himself but couldn't. The forensic anthropologist on site noted defensive wounds along the ulna, tiny fractures and bruising likely sustained before or during the entrapment. There was also a jacket, torn, faded, still red in places but mostly brown with age and rust stains. It was balled up beneath the body, wedged against the rib cage, as if he'd used it for support or protection. A sleeve had been ripped nearly in half. There were fibers embedded into the panel wall that matched the jacket's lining. He'd tried to brace himself, maybe push off, maybe claw his way out, but the most damning detail wasn't the position or the breaks or even the bruises. It was the absence of fresh oxygen. The space he'd been trapped in was sealed tightly enough that his own breath would have used up the available air within hours. The official cause of death, positional asphyxiation. He couldn't move, couldn't stretch out, couldn't expand his lungs fully. The air became heavy, wet with exhales, and then gone. They estimated he'd survived for several hours after being trapped, maybe longer. The final DNA test confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains belonged to Jamie. His molar matched dental records. A lock of hair preserved in a baby book from his mother matched mitochondrial DNA. The forensic team informed the sheriff, who made the call himself. When Michael Elwood answered the phone, he didn't speak for 21 seconds. Then, "I know," was all he said. Donna didn't attend the press briefing. Michael stood alone at the podium, reading from a folded piece of paper with trembling hands. He said, "Thank you to the community. Thank you to the volunteers." Then he paused and said something no one expected. "He was in there," he whispered. "He was always there." The whole time the press swarmed. Questions came like hailstones. How did no one find him? Why wasn't the bus fully dismantled back in 2006? Could he have fallen in by accident? Or was he put there? That last question hung in the air longer than the rest. Investigators went back through every image, every panel, every blueprint. The cavity Jamie had been found in wasn't listed on any design schematic. It appeared to be the result of a manufacturing defect, a space between two panels that should have been sealed but weren't. The bus model had only been in use for a few years before being discontinued. No recalls had been issued for structural integrity. There was only one way to access that compartment, through a floor panel behind the rear seats, a narrow service hatch, never meant for student access. Investigators had dismissed it early on because it was bolted shut during the 2006 sweep, but rust patterns indicated that at some point it had been loosened and resealed. When they returned to the original maintenance logs, one entry stood out, dated February 6, 2006, 2 days before Jamie vanished. It read, "Rear floor panel rattling again. Malloy to address that name again. Richard Malloy, a subcontractor with a paper-thin trail. Hired, worked briefly, then gone. No forwarding address, no social security matches since 2017. And when detectives dug deeper, they found something else. He'd worked maintenance jobs in 2 other districts in the late 90s. One had reported a missing lunchbox incident. involving a child who later claimed to have been locked in the bus on purpose. That case had been dismissed as imagination. The boy was never hurt, but the bus he'd described had a similar floor panel design. None of this was admissible. None of it proved anything. Malloy was dead, hit by a train in 2017 near Tremont County. He'd been homeless for years. No suicide note, no witness, just a man with a long trail of transient work and a name that kept showing up in the margins. Back at the forensic lab, one final detail emerged. On the interior wall of the cavity, barely visible through corrosion and residue, was a partial palm print. Pressure embedded. Humans, not Jamie's. It had been left facing outward, toward the exit. When they ran it through archived DMV records, they got a hit: Richard Malloy. The lead investigator closed the folder and didn't say a word for a long time. They had their bodies. They had their cause of death. But the real answer, the one everyone needed, was still tangled in something older, deeper, and far more deliberate than they'd ever imagined. The forensic reconstruction of Bus 46 took place in a climate-controlled bay inside the state's evidence facility, 4 hours from Tremont. For the first time since 2006, the bus wasn't treated like a mystery. It was treated like a crime scene. Engineers and structural analysts were called in, not just to extract parts, but to recreate what had happened inch by inch. Investigators needed to know one thing: how could an 8-year-old boy disappear inside a vehicle designed for daily transport without a single adult noticing? The first discovery came early. Behind the last row of seats, beneath the emergency window, was a maintenance panel. Technically, it was a removable floorboard, installed to allow access to brake lines and insulation during factory assembly. But on Bus 46, the panel had long since been rusted over, welded in place by time, except the corrosion didn't match the surrounding metal. It was thicker, uneven, recent compared to the rest of the frame. Further testing revealed signs of heat, not from the engine. This section wasn't near the core mechanics, but from a torch. Someone had sealed the panel after the fact. Burn residue traced in streaks across the outer lip, as if it had been hastily welded shut. From the inside. The working theory had always been accidental entrapment, that Jamie had fallen through or climbed in during a bumpy ride. Maybe he'd dropped something. Maybe he crawled after it. But as more panels came loose and the interior was exposed, that version began to unravel. First came the nail scratches. Inside the cavity where Jamie's body had been recovered, the walls were peppered with gouges. Deep, erratic, uneven. Not made with tools, not made with metal. Human fingernails, verified by residue. They traced in arcs along the side panels, sometimes crisscrossing, sometimes concentrated in clusters, like he'd tried to dig upward or sideways. Some were shallow, some had blood. There were places where the rust had been disturbed but never penetrated, just dulled from contact again and again. But what stopped everyone cold was the imprint. Near the inner latch mechanism, where the access panel would have opened from the inside, was a palm print, smudged but legible, left not in dirt or grease but in something older. An oil composite used for lubrication, mixed with what the lab later confirmed was carbon soot. The angle suggested someone had braced themselves while sealing the hatch. The size was too large to be Jamie's. The print had partial loops and ridges, not enough for a full match, but enough to compare. When they ran it against the archive, one partial stood out: Richard Malloy. Again. This changed the narrative completely. Jamie hadn't crawled into space, he'd been placed there. From the position of the limbs, the curled shape, and the shoe found braced near the panel's edge, analysts now believed Jamie had been conscious when he was sealed inside, likely panicked. He might have screamed, once. The rest would have been muffled by steel and insulation. The scraping sound one girl heard on the bus that morning aligned perfectly with the moment the panel was believed to have been closed. A gasp, then a drag. Like something or someone was being shoved into place. One investigator noted that the locking mechanism had been damaged in a way that suggested force, like someone had slammed it shut from above, jarring the bolt. The latch wasn't broken, but bent. It had taken pressure to seal, more pressure to keep it shut. There was no sign Jamie had ever gotten back near it from inside. He had tried to claw the walls instead. This changed the timeline. The idea that Jamie had simply vanished along the route no longer held up. He never got off the bus, not at a wrong stop, not near a mysterious green-roofed house. He was on that bus from start to finish, but no one saw him because he wasn't in the seats. He was beneath them, beneath the floor, trapped between steel, dying in silence while the world kept moving above him. The investigation circled back, full orbit, to the early days. Who had access to the bus that week? Who had the tools? Who worked alone? Richard Malloy's name kept surfacing. He had been hired to assist with panel reinforcement just days before Jamie disappeared. He signed off on Bus 46's inspection that same week. His employment ended abruptly in April. Records listed incompatibility with staff as the reason. He'd left town soon after. They traced him to a halfway house in 2010, to a camp outside Charleston in 2015. Then nothing. His death in 2017, struck by a train alone on the tracks, was ruled an accident. Toxicology was clean, no note, no history of illness. Just a man who moved around, took jobs with minimal oversight, and left behind a trail of oddities no one had questioned until it was far too late. For the Elwoods, the confirmation that Jamie had never left that bus shattered whatever illusions remained. Dana sobbed in front of the state investigator, asking only one question: how long had he stayed alive? The answer was unbearable. Based on decay patterns, fluid residue, and blood oxidation, Jamie likely lived for several hours, possibly overnight, long enough to scream, long enough to claw, long enough to believe someone might hear him. And no one did. The transition to digital record-keeping in the Tremont County School District had been slow. Boxes of old maintenance logs, work orders, and handwritten memos were kept in a back room behind the transportation office for over a decade, covered in dust and rarely opened. In early 2024, just after the discovery under Bus 46, a district clerk tasked with scanning the old paperwork into the new system flagged a stack labeled 2005 to 2007. Most were uneventful: tire changes, oil logs, seatbelt replacements. But one binder, maintenance batch 46RM, was different. Inside, a cluster of yellowed pages contained notes from a temporary hire. Scrawled in ink that had faded to brown, the signature at the bottom of several entries read, R. Malloy. The name had already surfaced in whispers and fragments, tied to both the physical condition of Bus 46 and the arson-suspected fire that had killed Teresa Connell years earlier. But this was something else. Documentation. His presence wasn't just anecdotal. He was, on paper, assigned to Bus 46 in the week leading up to Jamie Elwood's disappearance. One note, dated February 6, 2006, just 2 days before the incident, read, "Rear floor panel rattling again. Asked to leave access open, per Malloy." The handwriting was rough, rushed, the kind that didn't expect to be reviewed. There was no counter-signature, no follow-up entry confirming the panel had been resealed. That line, buried in a forgotten ledger, shifted the tone of the investigation from oversight to intent. Detectives brought the page into evidence and reopened the personnel file from the same period. Malloy had been hired on a 3-week subcontract to assist with winter fleet repairs. His references were listed, but phone numbers were dead ends. The address on file led to a trailer lot in Boone County that had been leveled in a flood years earlier. No state-issued certification was attached to his application. His background check, marked pending in red ink, had never been updated. He had worked under a maintenance lead who passed away in 2014, leaving few people who remembered him. But one former mechanic, Ray Thurman, still lived nearby. When contacted, Ray didn't recall much. Just that Malloy was quiet, kept to himself, but always hanging around the buses longer than needed. He remembered him asking a lot of questions, not about repairs, about compartments, panels, storage design. At the time, Ray assumed he was just thorough. Now, he wasn't so sure. When the sheriff's department tracked down Malloy's last known location, it was a cold trail. He had died in 2017, found near the tracks west of Tremont, body torn by impact, no witnesses. At the time, it had been classified as accidental, but in light of the recent findings, detectives petitioned to unseal his personal effects. What they got back was thin: a torn backpack, a set of bus keys not tied to any known district, and a single black notebook. Inside were disjointed writings. Most were unreadable. Scribbled phrases, fragmented sentences, some that stood out: too much light under the seat, don't close the panel until it's still, and the bus keeps talking even when it's empty. None of it made direct reference to Jamie, but the tone was unsettling, disconnected, paranoid. A psychological profile flagged by the department's forensic psychologist suggested signs of disassociation. Malloy had likely been unraveling long before 2006, and yet he had slipped through. Back at the district office, another log surfaced, this one from February 10th, 2 days after Jamie disappeared. It noted bus 46 was inspected again for floor noise. The technician's notes were brief: sealed rear access, weld complete. No explanation as to why it had been open. No comment on what was found, because, officially, nothing was. That inspection had been signed by a different tech. Malloy had already left the premises. When asked years later why the weld hadn't raised red flags, that technician, now retired, admitted he thought it was part of Malloy's earlier work. I figured he'd left it for me to seal. No idea anything was wrong. He had no reason to suspect otherwise. In 2024, detectives attempted to reconstruct Malloy's full employment history. It was patchwork. Temporary jobs across 3 states, gaps of years, small districts, underfunded, desperate for help, had likely skipped full vetting. No prior arrests, no family on record. A birth certificate from 1975 in Maryland. A social security trail that fizzled after 2010. What became clear wasn't just that Malloy had the opportunity. He had proximity, access, and time. He'd been assigned to bus 46. He knew its flaws. He knew which panels rattled, and he knew when and how to close them. Yet, he never spoke, never confessed, never hinted at anything in the years that followed. The Elwoods never heard his name until now. And even then, it arrived as a whisper on a decades-old work order. When detectives held the paper in their hands, it felt like an echo, one that had been waiting almost 20 years to be heard. The handwriting was messy. The ink is nearly gone. But the meaning was clear. Jamie never had a chance, and someone, quiet, unremarkable, barely remembered, had made sure of it. The final forensic sweep of bus 46 came not with fanfare, but with a quiet sense of duty. By then, Jamie's remains had been returned to his family. The story had broken nationally. Investigators had combed through every known surface, every panel, every bolt. But one tech, Sarah Lynn, meticulous, methodical, refused to sign off. Something about the frame still bothered her. There was a patch beneath the central rear undercarriage, near where the frame met the heat shielding, that hadn't been examined closely. Rust had eaten through the outer layer, but beneath it was a smooth, factory-grade surface, sealed, hidden, protected. She used a soft bristle brush, working slowly, flake by flake, until the corrosion gave way to bare metal. Then, under the forensic light, it appeared, half obscured by years of grime, faint but unmistakable. A handprint, not a smear, no residue. A deliberate palm-down print, as if someone had steadied themselves there during the act of sealing the compartment. It was angled downward, fingers spread, pressure consistent with bracing weight. DNA had long since degraded, but the oil and trace compounds in the print ridgelines remained. Sarah photographed it, dusted it, lifted it. The moment the lab fed the image into the database, the match came back in under 20 seconds. Richard Malloy. The print was compared against archived DMV records, military files, and his 2017 death certificate thumb scan. It matched with 98.7% certainty. The print was his, and the location left no doubt. That hand had pressed down from inside the crawl space, from the same chamber where Jamie Elwood had died. This changed the language of the investigation. No longer accidental, entrapment. No longer unknown cause. With the print, it became premeditated. Someone had physically entered the compartment, lured or forced Jamie into it, and braced themselves to close him in. The size of the space meant it was a two-step act. Lift the child, angle the body, seal the hatch. It wasn't a panic move. It was practiced, calm, familiar. They re-examined the scratch marks inside the chamber, the abrasions, the blood under the fingernails, the bruises across Jamie's arms. All of it aligned with one truth. He had fought back. Not against entry. There was no sign of struggle before confinement, but against the closing, the finality. He'd clawed, pushed, kicked, but whoever was on the other side had already made the decision. Investigators returned to Malloy's personal effects. The black notebook they'd recovered from his final campsite contained erratic writing, paranoia, fragments, delusions. But one phrase, repeated multiple times, now stood out with chilling clarity. The rat box stays closed, scrawled on 3 separate pages, underlined once, then twice. Each instance is accompanied by drawings, crude lines representing a square, something braced shut from the outside. One page included a small figure curled inside, X marks for eyes. They didn't need further interpretation. Malloy had referred to the compartment as the rat box. Whether it was a term he invented or one he'd used elsewhere, no one knew. But it was deliberate, not a vent, not a space, a box, something to trap, something to contain. The implication was clear. Jamie had been intentionally placed there, trapped with knowledge and intent, sealed by a man whose fingerprints confirmed presence. And for nearly 2 decades, no one had known. The location of Malloy's death, mile marker 74, just outside Tremont, had always felt strange. A straight stretch of track, no blind curve, no obstruction. He'd been found just off-center, both hands in his coat pockets. The conductor said he never looked up. No flinch, no step, no hesitation. Some thought it was suicide. Others thought it was confusing. But now the theory has shifted again. It didn't matter whether he meant to die or not. Malloy had taken the answer with him. There was no one left to arrest, no charges to file. But the case was finally closed. At a press conference in late June, the sheriff stood before the town one last time. He read the findings, the timeline, the names. He said Jamie's death was not an accident. He said the bus had become a coffin because someone made it. And he said, plainly, that no child should ever be forgotten in plain sight for 18 years. In the back row, Dana and Michael Elwood sat silently. She held Jamie's jacket in her lap. He kept his eyes on the floor. When asked afterward if the closure helped, Donna simply shook her head. "Closure isn't real," she said. "It's just the last door that locks behind you." The bus was scheduled for destruction. But Michael requested one thing before it was done: a final inspection. He wanted to stand inside it, alone. The department allowed it. They said he climbed aboard slowly, walked to the back, and sat in the last row where Jamie always had. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He placed something on the seat, Jamie's old dinosaur toy, the one from his windowsill. Then he stepped off the bus and nodded. Bus 46 was crushed 2 weeks later. The last thing investigators preserved was the print, the one under the rust. It was framed in the sheriff's office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that some answers are buried not in fields or forests, but right beneath our feet, waiting silently until someone finally looks down.